Hey there. If you've stumbled into this story by accident or by gentle curiosity, welcome. If you're here to fall asleep, well, you're in better company than you think. Tonight, we begin with a tale as old as Greek dirt, and just as prone to crumbling softly into your memory foam pillow. We'll be spending some time, 20 drowsy chapters, in fact, wandering through the yawning halls of Mount Olympus, where the gods are as dramatic as they are tired, and where mythology unfolds not with thunderclaps, but with sighs, passive squabbles, and tea that's gone cold. So if your blanket is tucked, your fan is humming, and the only thing on your agenda is drifting off slowly into a dream shaped vaguely like a Grecian urn. Let's begin. Long before Olympus had mail service or indoor plumbing, the universe was more of a suggestion than a location. There was chaos, not the thrilling kind, but more like a large, empty lobby that someone forgot to decorate. Out of this lukewarm void came Gaia, the earth, who found herself rather alone and mildly inconvenienced by the lack of walls, conversation, or suitable footwear. So Gaia did what any ancient proto-being would do when faced with cosmic silence. She created Uranus. Not because she was particularly in the mood for romance, but because the skies were getting drafty. Uranus arrived fully grown, deeply mysterious, and absolutely terrible at fatherhood. Together, Gaia and Uranus had many children, which sounds exciting, but wasn't. The Titans were tall, sullen, and rarely left home. Cronus, one of the middlest of the batch, stood out because he looked vaguely responsible and could form complete sentences. Gaia, fed up with Uranus's habit of banishing their children into the Earth's cramped basement, handed Cronus a sickle and a long to-do list. Cronus, with all the enthusiasm of someone asked to mow the lawn during a heat wave, performed a grim family chore and became king. For a while, things were calm in that bureaucratic Titan kind of way. There were meetings. There were thunderless storms. There were lullabies that took 6 hours and included weather forecasts. But Cronus developed a small, nagging concern. Prophecies. Those ancient voicemail messages from the universe whispered that one of his own children would overthrow him. Rather than confront his parenting style, Cronus simply ate his offspring. This may sound dramatic, but in the realm of Titan child-rearing, it was essentially a form of prolonged timeout. Enter Rhea Cronus's long-suffering wife and professional birth hider. Tired of watching her children become hors d'oeuvres, she devised a plan that was in hindsight mostly successful. She gave Cronus a rock wrapped in a blanket, which he swallowed without chewing. The real baby Zeus was sent away to be raised by a goat and some suspiciously musical nymphs on the island of Crete. Zeus grew up slowly, like bread that forgot to proof. He spent his early years practicing thunderbolt safety and debating cloud formations with trees. The nymphs taught him how to speak in ominous tones, and the goat offered surprisingly sound advice about emotional regulation. By the time Zeus reached adulthood, measured in divine yawns rather than years, he was ready to return to the family business. Now you might imagine Zeus storming into Cronus's palace with a glowing weapon and a booming voice. But that's not how things happen in this story. Instead, Zeus showed up with a plan, a lukewarm potion, and a tone of polite confrontation. He offered Cronus a drink, which, unbeknownst to everyone but the goat, was laced with a very convincing emetic. One by one, Zeus's siblings emerged from Cronus's stomach, slightly damp and very confused. Hestia, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and Demeter joined Zeus in what could loosely be called a revolt, but more closely resembled a slow-moving inheritance dispute. And so began the Titanomachy, a war between the old gods and the slightly newer ones. It lasted 10 years, which was considered short by divine standards. The battles were loud, but strangely inconclusive. Mountains were moved. Oceans were stirred. No one really cleaned up afterward. Eventually, with the help of the Cyclopes, who had been in storage, and the Hecatoncheires, who were mostly arms Zeus, and his siblings, managed to push the Titans into a deep, cosmic trench called Tartarus. Think of it as the divine version of a very secure filing cabinet. Zeus emerged victorious, not with fanfare, but with a detailed list of new responsibilities and a mild sinus condition from all the celestial dust. He took the sky. Poseidon dot the sea. Hades, with his usual luck, received the underworld dark drafty and excellent for brooding. Thus, the reign of the Olympians began not with a bang, but with paperwork. Zeus, now king of the gods, ordered a throne with extra lumbar support and began issuing proclamations about cloud density. Mount Olympus was open for business, and the golden age of semi-dramatic divine bickering had officially begun. But that, dear listener, is merely the first yawn in a saga of slow-burning intrigue and tepid passion. For now, close your eyes. Imagine a thunderbolt dimmed for comfort. Let the sleepy winds of Olympus drift over you like a toga made of fog. Now that Zeus had more or less stumbled into power, the Olympian household needed organization, or at least the appearance of it. Mount Olympus, perched somewhere between ambition and altitude, sickness had all the charm of an open-plan office with too many gods and not enough chairs. Naturally, this called for the establishment of routines, responsibilities, and passive-aggressive memoranda. Enter Hera, goddess of marriage, queen of Olympus, and unofficial head of the Committee for Domestic Oversight. A body that did not technically exist, but whose influence was felt every time Zeus tried to schedule a lightning engagement without prior notice. Hera had not exactly volunteered for this role, but the alternative was letting Zeus handle the divine calendar, which had already resulted in 3 overlapping harvest festivals and a weather pattern best described as emotionally unstable. So Hera, with her meticulously inked scrolls and a quill that could pierce stone, set to work. She drafted the first official Olympian duty roster. It was neither exciting nor binding, but it gave everyone something to blame when things went predictably wrong. Apollo was to handle daylight poetry recitals and seasonal allergies. Artemis would manage moonlight wilderness preservation and the proper folding of cloaks. Poseidon, ever the water enthusiast, was in charge of all things damp, including emotional storms and rogue tides. Athena took over wisdom strategy and reminding people to use coasters. Ares was placed under review. Hephaestus was given the forges a modest tool budget and a list of repairs that began with Zeus's ego and ended somewhere around fix the throne leg. Dionysus had yet to be assigned a task, mostly because he refused to attend meetings that began before noon. Hermes, having shown up to the first meeting uninvited, but already holding the minutes, was assigned travel logistics and message delivery, a job he accepted with a shrug and a pair of winged sandals he claimed were a hand-me-down from the wind. Hestia, quiet and content, kept the hearth lit and the tea slightly oversteeped. But Hera managed the big picture. She coordinated festivals, oversaw sacrifices, and ensured Zeus didn't declare Wednesday illegal by accident again. Her days were filled with scheduling conflicts, altar audits, and reassigning nymphs who had mysteriously vanished after being complimented by Zeus. Despite her calm exterior, Hera harbored a slow, simmering exasperation. Zeus, in his defense, did attempt to be kingly. He conducted inspections of clouds, delivered speeches to eagles, and invented 6 new types of thunderclap, all of which sounded the same, but his attention span was shorter than a mortal's lifespan, and his idea of long-term planning involved deciding whether to smite or seduce, which, as Hera noted in her journal of divine complaints, were not mutually exclusive actions. And then there were the affairs. Not affairs of state, which Hera would have preferred, but the kind of affairs that involved Zeus transforming into anything from a swan to a rain cloud to a moderately handsome shepherd with suspiciously good hair. These liaisons, always inconvenient and seldom well disguised, resulted in an expanding collection of demigods' prophecies and paperwork. Hera responded with a mix of diplomatic grace and internalized thunder. She launched investigations, occasionally turned someone into a small animal, and updated the Olympus Charter to include a clause on unauthorized mortal fraternization. One particularly cloudy Tuesday, she hosted a summit on the state of divine discipline. Attendance was mandatory, and refreshments were not provided. Ares arrived late with a bruise he couldn't explain. Aphrodite claimed she was emotionally overbooked. Zeus tried to call in sick, citing incipient omnipotence. Fatigue. But Hera simply had Hermes drag him in by the hem of his toga. The meeting concluded after several hours of bickering and one impromptu duel with the agreement that discipline would be considered when feasible. Hera circled that phrase in red and underlined it twice. Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, Olympus functioned. Sort of. Mortals still offered sacrifices, seasons still rotated, and most temples remained structurally sound. Hera, watching it all from her cloud-wrapped observatory, adjusted the divine schedule for the third time that week, and sighed in a tone only audible to those attuned to divine disappointment. She did not expect perfection. She barely hoped for competence, but she insisted on order, even if it meant dragging it inch by inch behind her, like a reluctant chariot pulled by bickering deities. As the sun dipped below the horizon and Apollo logged off for the evening, Hera remained seated at her desk, reviewing parchment after parchment, editing a list of prohibited mortal disguises Zeus was no longer allowed to use. She paused briefly at giant golden antelope and made a note to follow up. Outside, a minor god tripped over a storm cloud, and someone accidentally turned a goat into a philosopher. Hera didn't flinch. Instead, she poured herself a cup of warm nectar, closed her eyes for just a moment, and made a mental note to reorganize the Pantheon's emergency response team, starting with a proper definition of emergency. Somewhere nearby, Zeus was preparing another speech about unity and excellence. Somewhere farther away, Hermes was already writing a memo titled "The Accidental Lightning Incident, a Learning Opportunity." But Hera, in that brief stillness, allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not joy, not peace, just the mild contentment that comes from knowing tomorrow would be equally unpredictable, and that she at least would be ready. Because someone had to be. And as the stars blinked into view above Olympus, Hera leaned forward, dipped her quill again, and began drafting a new list of duties, one that would soon find its way into the hands of a reluctant god with a torch and a half-finished to-do list whose story was only just beginning to unfold. The torch Hera passed metaphorically and with considerable expectation landed in the slightly calloused, soot-smeared hands of Hephaestus, god of fire forges, and all things clunky and underappreciated. While other gods preferred lofty clouds and poetic sunlight, Hephaestus's realm was more subterranean, in moodstone corridors, humming with the rhythm of anvils, the air thick with the scent of old bronze and philosophical smoke. Assigned by Hera herself, who believed in productive labor more than divine leisure, Hephaestus had taken to his duties with the resigned diligence of someone who knew that even miracles required screws that fit and doors that didn't squeak. His workshop, tucked somewhere between the base of Olympus and the crust of practicality, was a labyrinth of half-finished inventions and forgotten obligations. Sparks flitted like shy moths in the gloom as celestial gears clinked into place with the kind of gentle inevitability that made clocks nervous. Hephaestus wasn't what one would call nimble. He walked with the uneven rhythm of a god who had been tossed from the heavens as a baby, an event no one liked to bring up unless they were trying to win an argument. His left leg dragged slightly, and his robes had burn holes in strategic places, but his hands, those stubborn, soot-stained hands, were steady, sure, and perpetually busy. On this particular morning, which smelled faintly of melted copper and philosophical resignation, Hephaestus was attempting to repair Zeus's throne again. The left armrest kept humming ominously, and the reclining function had gone from mildly divine to dangerously elastic. Too much ego pressure, he muttered, tapping a rivet back into place with a hammer that had once doubled as a diplomatic gift. He was only partially kidding. Around him, the forges hissed and clanged in irregular chorus. Golden automatons, silent assistants of his own design, moved quietly between anvils, carrying molten ideas and trays of cooling disappointment. They never asked questions. They never lost tools. They never brought up Aphrodite, which, frankly, was more than could be said for the rest of Olympus. The matter of his marriage to the goddess of beauty remained a cloud of unresolved sentiment and bureaucratic awkwardness. She had been assigned to him as one might assign drapery to a stone bench, and while Hephaestus bore no ill will, he also bore the weight of being politely pitied by nymphs and laughed at by birds. Their union had yielded no children, no harmony, and certainly no shared hobbies. She preferred mirrors. He preferred metal filings. They both avoided eye contact. Still, his forge was steady. It never asked where he had been. It only demanded he return, which he did day after glowing day. Today, however, Hera's most recent memorandum, hand-delivered by Hermes, who had taken to wearing sunglasses indoors to avoid making eye contact, rested heavily on his workbench. The parchment smelled faintly of responsibility. Hephaestus unrolled it with a sigh. Olympus Emergency Infrastructure. Evaluation, it read, followed by a numbered list of architectural and moral weaknesses. Item 4 mentioned the stairs between the Hall of Echoes and the Room of Unexplained Moods collapsing again. Item 7 concerned an incident with Dionysus and a structurally unsound balcony. There was also an attached footnote requesting a discreet lock for Zeus's personal observatory, which had recently been misused by a goose. Hephaestus rubbed his temples, then reached for a wrench that had last been used to fix an altar that had developed a tendency to chant unsolicited limericks. He didn't mind the work. He minded the expectations. Gods, unlike mortals, rarely said thank you. They expected things to function, to gleam, to hold their weight and their wine. When something broke, they summoned him with the tone used for ordering bread. When it worked, they forgot who had made it. But there was comfort in function, even if no one noticed. As he adjusted the valve on Apollo's new sun chariot, currently overheating and emitting musical notes in the key of confusion, Hephaestus allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He was needed, not admired, not envied, but needed. The chariot sputtered, then purred, then lurched slightly forward, and stopped. Progress. From the corridor outside, his forge, faint voices drifted down Aphrodite's laugh, Hermes making excuses, Artemis sighing about shoe prints in her temple. Hephaestus didn't flinch. He adjusted the temperature control, tightened the axle, and added another bolt just in case. When in doubt, he always added one more bolt. It was a principle, not a strategy. Later that afternoon, though time on Olympus was more of a suggestion than a schedule, Athena arrived carrying a shield that had recently developed an unwanted facial expression. It keeps smirking during ceremonies, she explained, placing it carefully on a velvet pad Hephaestus kept for visits from gods with standards. He examined the shield, tapped its edge, and nodded thoughtfully. Prideful enchantment. Probably picked it up near the Acropolis. Athena, always the diplomat, raised one eyebrow, but said nothing. Hephaestus adjusted the smirk with a mallet and reprogrammed the expression to dignified neutrality. She left with a nod. He returned to his forge. And so the hours passed, each clang of his hammer a rhythm against Olympus's more chaotic tempo. While the other gods debated, seduced, wandered, and occasionally transformed into poultry, Hephaestus remained grounded, iron-willed, and perpetually 10 steps behind on repairs. As night crept over the mountaintop, his forge glowed soft and steady, lighting the caves from within, like a patient heart still beating. The hum of automatons slowed. The anvils cooled. The throne stopped humming for now. Outside, the stars blinked into position. Somewhere above, Zeus was rehearsing another speech about divine unity, while Hera drafted tomorrow's chores. Aphrodite was likely mid-laugh, and Hermes had probably misplaced a message or two. But below them all, in the hidden heart of Olympus, Hephaestus tightened the final screw of the day, adjusted the flame by half a breath, and unrolled a fresh blueprint titled Prototypes for Quiet Solutions. His hammer hovered, paused, and fell with a gentle clang as the next phase of sleepy divinity waited just beyond the workshop door. Just as Hephaestus settled into the quiet shuffle of coal and cogwheels, a light breeze nudged the forge door open, though there was no breeze scheduled until next Tuesday. In its place stood Hermes, god of travel mischief and messages that may or may not be delivered on time. He didn't so much walk in as appear half-hovering, with a grin that suggested he'd arrived early late, or possibly by mistake. His sandals, adorned with wings that flapped when bored, hovered an inch above the floor, which they disliked for being too committed to standing still. Hephaestus looked up from his bench of bolts and squinted through the dim haze of mild exhaustion. Hermes raised a scroll and gave it a gentle shake, as if it might unroll itself out of fear. "Message from Zeus," he said cheerfully. "Or Hera, or both. Depends on how recently they've argued." He dropped the scroll onto a pile of unrelated diagrams and began poking at a nearby automaton with the curiosity of someone who had never built one, but was confident he could accidentally improve it. Hephaestus grunted, without looking up, a sound that meant, "Please don't touch that," in every known language. Hermes, fluent in grunts, withdrew his finger politely. "They need a report," he added, as though Hephaestus's entire week hadn't already been devoted to the subtle art of divine repair. Status of the chariot throne and that humming cup Dionysus swears is sentient. Hephaestus simply gestured to a nearby shelf labeled functioning-ish. Satisfied that his task was complete and that no one had yet asked him to file anything, Hermes turned to leave, only to pause mid-glide. Actually, he said, shifting tone with the practiced ease of a god who could change subjects faster than a squirrel avoiding responsibility, I could use a favor." Hephaestus blinked slowly, a clear signal that favors were the currency of trouble. But Hermes continued undeterred. "There's well, let's call it a delivery backlog," he said, twirling his staff like it might point him to a better excuse. "Too many scrolls, too many gods, not enough winged interns." Hephaestus said nothing, but his hammer tapped once rhythmically on the anvil. So Hermes continued, "I've started delegating, mildly, selectively, mostly to myself, which means I'm behind. Not dramatically, just enough to inspire prophecy." He paused to adjust a scroll case that had been trying to escape his satchel. "Anyway," he said, "I thought I'd bring you with me today. You know, get some fresh air, tour the inefficiencies." Hephaestus stared at him, as if evaluating whether this was a joke, a test, or a misunderstanding of the word fresh. Hermes, as always, took silence for agreement and clasped his hands in glee. "Brilliant," he said. "We'll start with Artemis. She's asked for her moon reports to be delivered verbally. Something about scrolls attracting deer." And before Hephaestus could fully frown, they were off. Olympus did not have roads in the traditional sense. There were pathways, certainly, and the occasional, politely trodden cloud trail, but most of the travel occurred through divine shortcuts, doorways that moved when no one watched, and staircases that led to yesterday if taken at the wrong angle. Hermes navigated them with alarming cheer, chatting about recent temple renovations and a centaur with commitment issues. Hephaestus followed one step behind his tools, jangling with quiet judgment. They arrived at Artemis's glade just as the goddess herself was releasing a mildly confused hare back into the underbrush. She looked up, narrowed her eyes, and crossed her arms. "Late," she said. Hermes produced a scroll with a bow. "Technically, only if you're counting sunrise." Artemis took the scroll, sniffed it for enchantments, and muttered something about deer with paperwork phobias. Hephaestus, meanwhile, adjusted a moonbeam that had come loose and was casting unintended shadows in the wrong forest. Artemis grunted her thanks, then vanished behind a tree that wasn't there before. Next, Hermes declared as though delivering scrolls to gods with complicated opinions was a scavenger hunt. They visited Apollo's lounge next, where the sun god was reclining on a chaise made of golden regrets, composing a hymn about toenails. Hephaestus fixed a harp string that had started producing legal advice instead of music, while Hermes discussed solar trajectory adjustments and whether the sun should occasionally set sideways, just to keep mortals guessing. "Too much whimsy causes migraines," Apollo said flatly. Hermes made a note to consult the Muses about horizontal dusk, and then waved farewell. They passed through a hallway of echoes, nodded politely to a nymph who claimed to be a breeze, and arrived at the edge of Dionysus's vineyard, which was somehow upside down that day. The god of wine was mid-philosophical discussion with a grape. Hermes handed over a scroll. Dionysus used it to fan the grape. Hephaestus discreetly reattached a barrel that had begun levitating with self-esteem. "Busy day," Hermes said cheerfully, as they returned to the main corridor of Olympus, the air thick with half-finished intentions and the gentle clatter of unattended miracles. Hephaestus, exhausted in ways no hammer could fix, gave a single nod. Hermes clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that conveyed gratitude mischief and a future favor yet to be defined. "Thanks, old friend," he said. "Tomorrow we visit Hades. He's requested silence in triplicate." Hephaestus raised an eyebrow. Hermes grinned. "But first dinner. Assuming Hera hasn't banned olives again." And with that, they disappeared into the golden dusk of Olympus's least reliable hallway. Their path lit by a flickering lantern that seemed to hum the opening lines of a lullaby. No one quite remembered pointing quietly toward the underworld corridor, and the god who rarely asked for visitors, but had just this once sent a scroll marked "Urgent, if convenient." The corridor to the underworld wasn't marked, nor was it particularly inviting. It was the kind of hallway that smelled like old ink and forgotten memories, slightly cooler than the rest of Olympus, and just dim enough to make you question if it was always this long, or if the walls were quietly stretching while no one looked. Hermes, still buzzing with his usual caffeine-free enthusiasm, led the way without a lantern, claiming that he could navigate the descent by emotional instinct, which Hephaestus found profoundly unhelpful, but no longer surprising. Their sandals winged and otherwise clicked against the marble that slowly turned to stone, the polished echo of Olympus, giving way to the more textured, slightly damp silence of the subterranean realm. Hades, unlike his siblings, had no need for grandeur. There were no columns here, no sunbeams posed just right for dramatic entrances. Instead, the path sloped down into practical gloom, past a river that occasionally whispered secrets, and a stalagmite shaped suspiciously like Zeus, looking disappointed. At the base of the descent, they reached the administrative threshold of the underworld, part palace, part records office, part very tasteful mausoleum. Cerberus, the three-headed dog of security and belly rubs, looked up from his nap and gave a polite triple yawn. Hermes scratched behind one set of ears with practiced ease, murmuring something about updated mortal arrival lists, while Hephaestus stepped carefully over a clipboard that had grown legs and now wandered the hallway looking for a supervisor. The main chamber of Hades' domain resembled an unusually quiet library married to a waiting room. Everything was carved from dark stone, polished to a muted shine, the kind of surface that refused to reflect you unless you meant it. Soft torches burned in sconce-like whispers. There were filing cabinets, naturally ancient, enchanted, and thoroughly unhelpful, unless bribed with scented oil and compliments. At the far end of the hall, seated behind a desk that seemed more carved than constructed, was Hades. His robes were gray, with the faint shimmer of grave moss, his crown minimal and underwhelming, and his expression that of a civil servant who'd seen far too many forms filled out in triplicate. He looked up, sighed, as if this visit had been prophesied and forgotten in the shuffle, and gestured silently for them to sit, which they didn't, because the chairs in the underworld often sighed back. "I requested silence," Hades said, in a voice as smooth as marble, but just as heavy. Hermes offered a scroll with a flourish, and received quiet +1 guest. A bonus. Hades ignored the quip and unrolled the scroll with careful fingers. "This report," he said, without reading it, "concerns soul logistics. Olympus wants to know if we're reaching full occupancy." Hephaestus raised an eyebrow. Hermes shrugged. "They're worried about overbooking. Apparently a few temples misinterpreted the harvest moon and accidentally inspired too much piety. I've had 5 spontaneous pilgrimages," Hades muttered. 2 of them brought snacks. 1 tried to rearrange the statues. He tapped the desk, and a drawer slid open by itself. "We're not at capacity. We are, however, adjusting our welcome protocols. The boat ride is now self-guided. Charon's on break." He handed Hermes a list of updates, which appeared to be written in disappearing ink. "Read it fast," he advised. "The list resets if you blink too often." Hermes tried, failed, and tucked it away for future translation. Hephaestus, meanwhile, noticed a device on the corner of Hades' desk, a soul counter, subtle and elegant, softly ticking upward. "You built that?" he asked, gesturing. "Modified it," Hades replied. The original model screamed every time a tyrant entered. We found it distracting. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that only exists below ground, where no birds sing, and even echoes keep to themselves. Eventually, Hades leaned back. So he said, "What do they want beyond numbers?" "Reassurance," Hermes replied. "Olympus thrives on the illusion of control." "We all do," Hades said, and somewhere deep in the catacombs, a door closed with the finality of forgotten history. But no, he continued, we are not overwhelmed, not yet. But the flow is constant. The design is old. It was never meant to be modern. Hephaestus, whose entire life was fixing the divine equivalent of old plumbing, nodded slowly. What do you need? He asked. Hades glanced toward the river. Stability. Better record-keeping. A way to ensure the past doesn't rewrite itself through clerical errors. Hephaestus stroked his beard. A counter-archive, he said aloud. Mirrored backups. Ink that remembers what it was meant to say. Shelving that avoids chronological drift. And no whispers, Hades added. The shelves whisper when no one's around. It unnerves the skeletons. Hermes looked between them and whistled. That's a hefty upgrade, he said. How long? Hephaestus didn't answer, but his fingers were already tracing imaginary blueprints in the air shaping stone into compliance. I'll need materials, permission, a torch that burns history in reverse. Done, Hades said. And the torch. I'll make one, Hephaestus replied. It'll flicker backwards. The light will fall on yesterday without disturbing today. Hermes blinked. That's unusually poetic. Hephaestus just grunted, which might have meant thank you or don't start. Hades nodded. Start tomorrow. I'll inform the shades to expect architectural rearrangement. No disruptions, Hermes added cheerfully. We want the recently departed to feel mildly disoriented, not fully alarmed. Hades allowed the faintest hint of a smirk. They arrive confused. They leave nowhere. I can promise mild disorientation. Cerberus yawned again this time, with a soft thud, as his paws stretched out across 3 separate rugs. The fire dimmed to a contemplative glow. Hermes collected his scrolls. Hephaestus collected his thoughts. And together they ascended back toward the world above, where time ticked faster. Opinions floated higher, and Hera was likely wondering why her chart of divine punctuality now included footnotes about rivers and reluctant renovations. By the time Hermes and Hephaestus re-emerged from the gentle gloom of Hades's realm, Olympus had begun its soft transition into evening, a time marked not by shadows, but by the polite dimming of divine chandeliers and a communal agreement that all thunderclaps should be set to vibrate. Hephaestus, now carrying the scribbled remnants of an underworld renovation plan on the back of what used to be a census report, said nothing as he climbed the last of the marble steps. Hermes, whose energy never dimmed, even when the torches did chattered on about possible torch materials and whether anyone had considered using starlight as insulation. But as they rounded the final bend into the central plaza, they both slowed. There, seated beside the ever-burning hearth that no wind could extinguish, and no god dared redesign, was Hestia. She wasn't waiting. She was simply there, as she always was, wrapped in a shawl that seemed to hold the warmth of all previous winters, and none of their chill. The hearth flickered softly behind her, its flame more suggestion than fire, casting a golden glow that hummed a note just above silence. Hestia, goddess of the home, the heart and hospitality, so subtle you didn't notice it until it was missing, looked up with a gentle nod. "You're late for tea," she said, not accusingly, just as a factual observation of time and temperature. Hermes, to his credit, bowed in exaggerated apology, and Hephaestus simply sat on the nearest bench that didn't creak with dramatic weight. The bench had been built by Hestia herself, smooth, unremarkable, and never out of place. She poured 3 cups from a kettle that never boiled into clay mugs, that never cooled too quickly, and handed them out like rituals made personal. The tea was chamomile with a whisper of time, calming in a way that required no magic, only memory. They sipped in silence, broken only by the quiet burble of the hearth and the faint rustling of a divine to-do list forgotten nearby. "How's the underworld?" Hestia asked, not with curiosity, but with care. Hephaestus gestured vaguely with his mug. "Orderly," he said, "needs reshelving, and fewer whispering shelves." Hermes chuckled. "And more Charon. The boat's on self-checkout." Hestia nodded, as though she'd expected as much. "I sent a jar of oil for the ferry rudder," she added. "Cerberus tends to chew the tiller when no one's looking." Hephaestus raised an eyebrow, mildly impressed. "You send oil to Hades?" "I send oil everywhere," she replied. "You'd be surprised how many places need it." Hermes leaned forward slightly, the firelight dancing in the folds of his cloak. "What do you need, Hestia?" he asked, and for once his tone was still. She smiled, soft and slow. "Only what I always need," she said. "The flame must remain lit. The halls must not forget warmth. And someone must know where the spare linens are." "Even gods need rest," Hephaestus murmured. Hestia looked at him kindly, "and someone must make that rest possible." She rose then, gracefully, and without rustle, and adjusted the fire, not with a poker, but with a wordless nudge that only she could give. The flame responded not by rising, but by softening, as if it had exhaled. "The hearth," she continued, "is not just fire. It is place, memory, permission to stop moving. Without it, Olympus wanders, Ides do drift. arguments linger too long. Hermes looked down at his tea, uncharacteristically quiet. Hephaestus adjusted the strap on his shoulder, feeling the weight of design shift ever so slightly. Hestia turned to them both. "Soon," she said, "we'll need more than flame. Mortals have begun to forget. Their homes still have fires, but their hearts are colder. The temples empty slower now, but they do empty." She didn't say it as warning. She didn't need to. "What do you want us to do?" Hermes asked. Hestia blinked slowly. "Nothing heroic. Just remember to keep space for quiet things, for rest, for tea that's neither too hot nor too cold, for stories that pause before they end." She handed Hephaestus a folded cloth, undyed linen, stitched with symbols too old for language. "You'll need this for the shelves," she said. "They dislike chaos." Then she turned back to the fire, as if the conversation had merely drifted rather than concluded. The two gods rose. Hermes hesitated, looked back. "Do you ever want more?" he asked. Then this Hestia did not turn. "This is more. More than they know. More than most deserve." And so they left the fire behind them, flickering steadily, casting long, warm shadows across the halls of Olympus. In the distance, the voices of other gods rose and fell. Ares was likely threatening a decorative vase again, and Aphrodite had probably convinced another mortal bard to write questionable poetry in her honor. But near the hearth, all was still, and somewhere, tucked into the pocket of Hermes's cloak and the curl of Hephaestus's plans, Hestia's quiet reminder burned on waiting to be needed, not loudly, but inevitably, as their next stop took them not to a palace or a forge or a throne, but to a garden grown more wild than tended, where another goddess was digging with her bare hands in soil older than Olympus itself. The path from Hestia's hearth to Demeter's garden was less a trail and more a meandering guess marked by the occasional vine with opinions. Olympus, while fond of architecture and occasional grand statements in marble, allowed its green spaces to obey their own logic, and Demeter's garden was the prime example, a softly sprawling expanse of moss, fruit, and weeds that may or may not have earned their place. Hermes, now slightly slower after tea, but still humming with residual motion, led the way with a lazy twirl of his staff, brushing aside a fig branch that had grown too enthusiastic. Hephaestus followed boots scuffing the loamy earth with the kind of cautious respect only a craftsman has when entering a space ruled not by structure, but by intention. The air changed here, not dramatically, but noticeably. It smelled of damp things, growing of earth that remembered older seasons, and of leaves that knew more than they said. Birds chirped in a language too ancient for translation, and in the distance something buzzed without schedule. They found her kneeling in the shade of an olive tree that hadn't stopped producing since the Trojan War. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mistress of wheat and wrath, had soil on her elbows and an expression halfway between concentration and philosophical irritation. Her hair was braided with strands of barley and twigs, not because it was fashionable, but because the garden had demanded it. She glanced up as they arrived, sighed, and gestured toward a patch of unruly lettuce that had recently unionized. "Sit," she said. "Don't disturb the mint. It holds grudges." Hermes complied with a graceful plop. Hephaestus found a moss-covered bench that adjusted itself slightly to accommodate his tool belt. Demeter returned to her task, replanting a wayward root that had wandered into basil territory. "I wasn't expecting visitors," she said, voice low and firm like the thud of a full basket. "Not until after the equinox. Blame Hestia, Hermes offered. She sent us with perspective and a cloth." He nodded at Hephaestus, who unfurled the linen and let Demeter examine the weave. She took it between her fingers, pressed it against her cheek, and smiled, faintly. Of course she did. Hestia always sends something useful, even if it looks like napkins. "We've just come from Hades," Hephaestus added. "Archives need rebuilding. Whispers, ghostly shelving, possibly mold." Demeter grunted. "Everything molds given time, even memory." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and walked toward a tangled arbor of grape and thorn. "Do you know what this garden is?" she asked without turning. "It's not paradise. It's not temple. It's negotiation. Every seed planted here argues with its neighbors. Every bloom requires a compromise. Even the weeds. Especially the weeds." Hermes leaned back on his elbows, watching a beetle navigate his boot. "Sounds like Olympus," he murmured. Demeter laughed, once dry, tired reel. "Exactly. The gods believe power is thunder and prophecy. But it's this convincing wild things to grow in circles, to give, to return." She pointed to a bed of sleeping poppies. "They don't grow because I tell them to. They grow because I wait." "Patience as a divine strategy," Hephaestus said thoughtfully. "Unfashionable," Hermes noted. "Essential," Demeter replied. "Especially now. Mortals forget to plant. They ask for harvest without season. They pave over soil and call it progress. But dirt remembers. It always remembers. She turned to face them, then brushing a leaf from her cheek. So what brings you truly? Don't say errands. I know errands. This is something else. Hermes considered dodging the question with charm, but something about Demeter's gaze, steady green, not entirely botanical, made him pause. Olympus is twitching, he said. Small things out of order. Shelves, shrines, a general creakiness, cracks beneath the marble, Hephaestus added. And not the usual kind. Demeter nodded slowly. Then the roots are restless, she said. The foundations of things are tired. Not broken, just unattended. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the moss. Do you know what happens when you forget to rotate crops? Hermes blinked. They sulk. They die, she said, quietly, then loudly. And soon the soil turns on you. Hephaestus shifted, uncomfortable. So what do we do? Demeter reached into a woven basket and pulled out a handful of seeds, unlabeled, dusty, humming faintly with the hum of buried futures. Plant new things, she said. But don't abandon the old. Water what's left. Weed carefully. Not everything wild is wrong. She handed the seeds to Hermes. Scatter them where the stone is soft, not all at once. And don't tell Ares. He'll try to train them to march. He would, Hermes admitted. He tried to recruit some dandelions last week. Of course he did, Demeter said. They're fierce when provoked. A breeze stirred through the garden, then warm and slow, the kind that didn't move the leaves, but reminded them that wind still existed. In the distance, the sound of a ripe pomegranate falling punctuated the moment, like a period in a sentence that had been waiting for breath. Tell Hera. Demeter said softly that her schedule is dry. She's planning with chalk. She needs water. Hephaestus tilted his head. Literal water. Metaphorical, Demeter said. But maybe also literal. The fountains near the main hall are sulking again. They rose, then quietly, not wanting to disturb a patch of ferns mid-negotiation. Hermes pocketed the seeds. Hephaestus made a note to reinforce the root systems under the west colonnade. As they left, the vines behind them adjusted slightly, as if acknowledging the moment without committing to it. And ahead, beyond the soft curve of the path, the marble began again. Olympus loomed not threatening, but waiting. At its far edge, a shimmer of joy and song beckoned faintly, where a god of light was tuning his instruments with the solemnity of someone who knew that even music could misbehave if not properly supervised. Past the garden, where Demeter's plants whispered amongst themselves and agreed to disagree on what season it was Sura, the path curved gently toward a space that shimmered faintly with rhythm. The sound grew as they walked soft strums of lyres tuning themselves, harps adjusting their own strings, and a flute somewhere in the background warming up with a scale that included one note too many. Hermes still cradling Demeter's seed pouch in one hand and a half-forgotten joke in the other, began to hum along. Hephaestus, naturally more immune to melody than attuned, winced only when the harmonies veered into theoretical territory. At the center of this acoustic convergence stood Apollo, radiant, not in the blinding way of Zeus's temper, but with the sort of glow that suggested someone had polished him recently, and he might be due for another coat. He was seated on a stool made of responsibly harvested laurel wood, surrounded by a semicircle of self-conscious muses, and one overconfident swan. In his hands was a golden lyre, gleaming like ambition, held together with strings. Apollo was tuning, but more spiritually than musically. "It's in D divine," he announced, without looking up. "Or perhaps C celestial. Depends on your mood." Hermes stopped just short of stepping on a tambourine that looked sensitive. "We bring greetings from the hearth, the forge, and the roots beneath," he said, in a tone halfway between formality and improvisation. Apollo finally looked up, one eyebrow raised, like a well-trained note. And here I was, thinking it was a social call. "It's a maintenance call," Hephaestus offered, setting down his tool pouch with a soft metallic clunk. "Something's off." "Not wrong, just off." Hera's scheduling meetings, Hades is reorganizing time, and Demeter handed us prophetic legumes. Apollo strummed a chord that sounded suspiciously like contemplation. I've felt it, too. The music of Olympus is out of balance. Nothing dissonant, just unaligned. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the choir behind him. Even the muses are arguing over tempos, and the echoes have begun returning the wrong phrases. "The wrong phrases?" Hermes asked. "What do you mean? You say hello, and they say why now?" Apollo replied, "It's unsettling. Poets are confused. Some have started writing silence." "That could be an improvement," Hermes muttered. Apollo ignored the jab and stood adjusting the folds of his robe, which gleamed like well-rehearsed daylight. "I've tried recalibrating the scales," he said, "but music doesn't respond to order alone. It needs intention, purpose, a shared rhythm." Do you suspect sabotage? Hephaestus asked, mostly out of professional curiosity. Apollo shook his head. No, I suspect distraction. Olympus is fraying at the edges, not from malice, but from drift. We've all begun humming our own songs, louder than before. He moved toward a nearby pedestal, where a scroll lay open beside a metronome ticking steadily against its own will. Even mortals are composing prayers in uncertain meters. They ask for light, but also for shade, for victory, but also for pause. Their voices are overlapping. Hermes leaned over to read the scroll. It contained lyrics, incomplete, looping back on themselves with footnotes and sighs. Do you want us to fix it? He asked. Apollo smiled, but it was a quiet sort of smile, more minor key than major. You can't fix music. You can only guide it. Bring it into alignment. Remind it of harmony. He turned back to the muses, who had begun quietly debating whether inspiration required snacks. I've composed a new refrain, he said, a melody gentle enough to weave beneath the arguments. If it spreads, even the chaos may start to hum in time. He handed Hermes a folded piece of parchment. Play it where the tension peaks, where sound becomes noise. Hermes raised an eyebrow. That's quite a few places. Start with Ares, Apollo said. He's been sparring with thunder again. Oh, joy, Hermes replied. Nothing says rhythm like war drums and dented pride. Apollo turned to Hephaestus next. You'll need to adjust the resonance of Olympus's halls. Some of them are echoing doubt. Others are amplifying complaints. I'll retune the stone, Hephaestus said, but I'll need time, and probably chalk. Apollo nodded. Use gold dust. It responds to harmony, and to pride, which is close enough. The muses began to hum awkwardly, at first, then, with hesitant unity. Apollo stepped back, allowing the sound to rise without directing it. That's the goal, he said. Not perfection, cohesion. Even discord can harmonize if you listen long enough. The light around him pulsed once not brightly, but like breath. Hermes tucked the parchment into his cloak beside Demeter's seeds. Anything else? He asked. Apollo's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Yes, remind Artemis that the moon's overture is slightly sharp. She won't like hearing it, but she'll know what to do. Noted, Hermes said. And the swan. Ignore the swan, Apollo said. He thinks he's a metaphor. They turned to go. Then the music swelling behind them, like a memory rehearsing itself. Olympus stretched ahead, marble and myth and unresolved harmonies. Beyond the main courtyard, past the statues of former declarations, lay the training ground where Ares had recently declared war on a breeze and was now attempting to discipline his armor into staying on straight. And it was toward that clanging rhythm of effort and ego that Hermes and Hephaestus now walked, parchment in pocket hammer in hand, and the first few bars of Apollo's melody already starting to play softly between their thoughts. The clang of metal grew louder with every step, less like music and more like percussion practice conducted by someone who had never been told to stop. It was not war, not exactly, but it was certainly the sound of someone trying to convince the sky that war was a reasonable next step. Hermes and Hephaestus emerged into the training grounds, an open space etched into the side of Olympus with deliberate grandeur, where columns had been positioned mostly to be knocked over, and statues existed solely to be glared at. At the center stood Ares, god of war, god of bruised pride, and rehearsed aggression, dressed in armor that gleamed like self-confidence, polished daily. He was swinging a spear at a set of increasingly nervous training dummies, which had been reinforced 3 times this week, and had recently begun developing minor philosophical doubts. Form Ares bellowed, though there was no one else around to form anything. He paused, only when he noticed the approaching duo, Hermes twirling his staff like a baton, Hephaestus trudging slightly with the weight of purpose and tools. Ares said, stabbing the ground with theatrical flourish, "The courier and the tinkerer, what brings you to the field of valor? Need something broken repaired, actually." Hermes replied, stepping lightly over a shield that had given up mid-duel. "Apollo says you've been rhythmically aggressive." Ares frowned. "Rhythm is for bards and dancers. I prefer impact." He gestured to the row of half-melted helmets lined neatly along a bench, each one a lesson. In metallurgy, failure. Hephaestus muttered, squatting beside one and poking at the dents with professional disdain. These were ceremonial. "Not anymore," Ares said proudly. "They are now educational." Hermes reached into his cloak and produced the parchment Apollo had given him. "Your tempo, dear warbringer, is off. Apollo wants this played, or hummed, or at least not drowned beneath the sound of solo combat drills." Ares eyed the parchment like it had personally questioned his lineage. "Music," he said in the same tone one might use for rash or tax audit. "We're not throwing a festival." "It's not for dancing," Hermes said. "It's to recalibrate Olympus. balance harmony, shared resonance, or at least fewer discordant grunts. Ares crossed his arms, his armor creaking in protest. The battlefield is not a concert hall. Perhaps not? Hephaestus said, still inspecting a broken training sword, but right now your aggression is echoing into the foundations. The Hall of Verdicts developed a tremor yesterday. Hera blamed earthquakes. It was your footwork. Power requires demonstration. Ares insisted, planting his boots more firmly. Control requires restraint, Hephaestus countered, or at least better boots. Hermes sighed and unfolded the parchment. Just try it. Hum it under your breath if you must. Think of it as a battle rhythm, a tactical cadence, or a very subtle war chant. Ares narrowed his eyes. He took the parchment, squinting, as if the notes might reveal a weakness. Then, slowly, grudgingly, he tapped the handle of his spear against the ground 3 times. The Muses might not have approved, but the rhythm wasn't wrong. It was hesitant, uneven, but recognizably deliberate. A start. Fine, he said. But if this song weakens my strike, I'll pin it to Apollo's back. Excellent, Hermes said already, halfway to the edge of the arena. And maybe consider letting the dummies retire early. They look traumatized. Ares glanced at the row of padded figures. One had slumped completely sideways. He sighed, muttered something about weakness, and began rearranging them with a gentler hand than expected. Hephaestus followed Hermes out, muttering about reinforcing sparring fields with resonance-absorbent stone. He's not wrong, he said. Impact reveals faults, but he leaves no space for rest. He is rest-resistant, Hermes agreed, but perhaps a hummed lullaby of war will soothe him. As they walked, a faint rhythm followed them, metal tapping, not randomly, but with purpose. Behind them, Ares trained, not softer, but more in time. The wind changed slightly. The clouds above the arena parted just enough for the sunlight to land neatly on the field, like applause held in reserve. And as the clangs became slightly more measured, more thoughtful, Hermes and Hephaestus turned toward their next destination, a moonlit path where Artemis waited, bow in hand, expression unreadable and lunar shadows gathering like notes. Not yet played. The path to Artemis was not marked on any of the divine maps, mostly because Artemis had taken them all and hidden them in hollow trees. If a god needed to find her, they were expected to do so by instinct, intuition, or sheer inconvenience. Fortunately, Hermes specialized in all 3, and Hephaestus, though less inclined toward forest navigation, trusted the process with the kind of stoic patience reserved for craftsmen and weathered stones. They followed the trail of narrowing light where moonbeams touched leaves like secrets, and owl feathers drifted down without source. The silence here was not empty, but deliberate. It pressed gently, like a velvet curtain drawn around a private thought. Eventually, beneath a sky layered with stars that didn't blink unless told they found her, Artemis stood at the edge of a clearing, her bow resting against her shoulder, her gaze fixed on a distant constellation that had recently shifted positions, apparently without permission. She wore silver, not polished, but worn as if moonlight itself had grown tired and come to rest on her shoulders. Her expression, as always, was both alert and elsewhere. "You're off rhythm," she said, before either of them spoke. Hermes stopped mid-step. "Apollo sent us." "I know," she replied. "He said the moon was sharp." She glanced at the sky, where the crescent hung with an expression of polite defiance. "It's not sharp. It's precise." Hephaestus adjusted the strap on his tool belt, squinting at the shadows. "He says Olympus is out of tune." "It is," she said, "but not because of the moon." She turned toward them, eyes catching light in a way that made it unclear whether they were reflecting it or creating it. "The forest listens," she continued. "It hears the arguments, the shifting, the push to align what never needed to march." Hermes stepped forward and extended Apollo's parchment. "Then consider this a suggestion, not a command." She took the parchment without looking at it. "He used sea celestial," she murmured. "Typical." Folding the page carefully, she tucked it into a pouch that smelled faintly of pine and wild decisions. "I won't change the moon," she said, "but I'll adjust the wolves. They've been howling a measure too early. It confuses the deer." "Every note counts," Hermes said lightly, "even the wild ones." Artemis smiled faintly, not at him, but perhaps at the idea. "Do you know what harmony is, messenger?" she asked. "It's not sameness. It's coexistence, dissonance allowed to breathe." Hephaestus nodded, sensing agreement beneath the metaphor. Balance through allowance, not control. "Exactly," she said. "Tell Apollo that the moon will stay as it is, but I'll nudge the tide. A little." She began walking along the edge of the clearing, her footsteps making no sound even on the crisp leaves. "And tell Hera that the night doesn't need scheduling. It arrives whether we're ready or not." Hermes scribbled that down, unsure if it was meant for distribution or for irony. Also, Artemis added, glancing back, tell Ares to stop training his soldiers under moonlight. They frighten the foxes. He says it builds discipline, Hermes offered. It builds insomnia, she replied. Hephaestus took a slow step forward. Is there anything you need? Artemis paused. Clarity, she said. But that's a hunt I prefer to pursue alone. She motioned toward a nearby stone, partially covered in moss and moon shadows. That rock's been humming. Probably one of Apollo's failed chords. Can you quiet it? Hephaestus crouched, pressed a hand to the stone, and listened. There it was, faint, off-key, persistent. A fragment of music caught where it didn't belong. With a few precise taps from a tuning chisel. The note softened, then faded entirely, leaving only the sound of wind through the trees. Done, he said. Artemis inclined her head. Thank you. Hermes tilted his head skyward, watching the stars flicker in their assigned places. Do you ever feel like Olympus is breathing? He asked. Sometimes deeply, sometimes shallow. It holds its breath, Artemis said, often, waiting for something it can't name. Maybe we're naming it now? Hephaestus muttered, piece by piece. Artemis looked at them, both, her gaze the still point of a turning world. Then don't stop, she said, but walk quietly. Not everything wants to be found. With that, she disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only a shimmer of intention and the soft hush of a bowstring unpulled. The clearing dimmed, not in light, but in presence, as if it had been briefly borrowed and now returned. Hermes and Hephaestus turned back toward the path, guided now by instinct more than purpose. They said little as they walked the forest, absorbing their silence without complaint. Behind them, the moon held its position, sharp, precise, unwavering. Ahead, Olympus awaited with its marble corridors and metaphors, yet unspoken. And beyond that, still a ripple of laughter drifted from the direction of a villa lined with sea foam and secrets, where a goddess of beauty was most certainly waiting, with opinions about alignment, and very likely about the aesthetic properties of divine collaboration. The transition from Artemis's forest to Aphrodite's domain was as sudden as a sneeze during a silent vow. One moment, Hermes and Hephaestus were wrapped in the careful hush of leaves and logic, and the next they stepped onto a marble path dusted with flower petals that seemed to fall from nowhere in particular. The air smelled faintly of roses, possibly ambition, and definitely some kind of expensive oil that didn't exist in the mortal world. Aphrodite's villa appeared gradually, as if posing. The columns were tall, but not intimidating, painted in a blush tone that suggested charm without obligation. The windows sparkled in a way that implied they had been recently complemented, and the vines that curled up the balustrades were clearly curated by someone with a very specific aesthetic, and possibly a small team of enchanted gardeners. Hermes adjusted his cloak and gave Hephaestus a sideways glance. "You ready?" he asked, half joking, half resigned. Hephaestus grunted in a tone that meant this won't be straightforward, and stepped forward. The main entrance opened with theatrical timing, revealing a courtyard filled with carefully positioned lounging chairs, ambient laughter, and 3 small fountains that sparkled more than they splashed. Aphrodite stood on a balcony above, framed by curtains that fluttered with practiced elegance. She was adjusting an earring that hadn't been forged so much as persuaded into existence. "Well," she said, her voice floating down like perfume in a ballroom, "I was beginning to wonder if you'd forgotten me." "Unlikely," Hermes replied, bowing with a degree of flourish, only slightly exaggerated for effect. "You are impossible to misplace." "Or ignore," Hephaestus added flatly. Aphrodite smiled. "Oh, darling." That sounded almost sincere. She descended the curved staircase at a pace that made the marble steps question their own importance. As she reached the courtyard, the laughter quieted less out of reverence and more because her presence rearranged attention, like a polite hurricane. "Apollo sent us." Hermes began already unrolling the parchment with a note. Not musical exactly, more harmonizing. "Olympus is wobbling." "Please," Aphrodite said, taking the parchment with 2 fingers. "Olympus has always wobbled. It's built on ego and clouds. Try anchoring that with diplomacy." She skimmed the notes, eyes flicking across the page like a breeze turning gossip. He thinks the chords of divine interaction need softening. Typical. "And you disagree?" Hephaestus asked, already examining a nearby statue for unnecessary sparkle. "Oh, I agree," Aphrodite said, "but not with the diagnosis. The issue isn't disharmony, it's detachment. The gods have become uncourted." She paced a little, each step deliberate, each sentence measured. "You see, balance is not merely about tone. It's about attention, affection, a sense that one's presence matters. And lately, Olympus has been unromantic." Hermes blinked. "You're saying the gods need more love." "I'm saying they need to feel seen," she corrected. "Even war needs a witness." Even wisdom needs applause, and even thunder should receive a thank you now and then. She stopped by a mirror that reflected not her face, but the best possible version of whoever looked into it. Harmony, she said, is not born of silence. It is coaxed from friction, handled with grace. So what do you propose? Hephaestus asked, adjusting a poorly installed curtain rod with a subtle twist of his wrist. Aphrodite turned toward him, her expression softening. We reintroduce ceremony. Not grand gestures, those are exhausting, but small rituals, compliments passed without motive, offerings left with intent, smiles that aren't contracts. Hermes raised an eyebrow. You want Olympus to flirt with itself? Precisely, she said, beaming. A touch of charm goes a long way. Even the muses are more inspired when someone notices their hair. She handed the parchment back. Tell Apollo I'll adjust the air here, add a few measures of grace, and perhaps a chorus of sighs that harmonize with the sea breeze. But he must ensure that beauty isn't reduced to decoration. And Hermes asked, What should we tell her? Aphrodite paused. Tell her the temples need more mirrors, not for vanity, for reflection. She turned, then motioning toward a side garden where roses arranged themselves according to mood. Also, she added, Tell Ares to stop writing anonymous poetry. It's clearly him. No one else rhymes valor with petal. Hermes coughed to hide a laugh. Hephaestus, for his part, picked up a stray vase and quietly reattached its chipped base. Aphrodite pretended not to notice, but allowed the corner of her mouth to curve upward. You're still the only one who fixes things without being asked, she said, and you're still the only one who breaks them. Without regret, he replied, not unkindly. The moment passed, like a breeze over, still water felt not chased. They turned to leave the air behind them, filling once again with ambient sighs and the faintest sound of lyres retuning. Aphrodite remained in the courtyard, arranging light around her with the kind of attention that could be mistaken for magic, but was in fact much more difficult presence. As Hermes and Hephaestus stepped back onto the petal-strewn path, the sea wind shifted slightly. Ahead, the next name on their list awaited a god of messages, trickery, and possibly too many hats who had already sent himself a note reminding him not to forget that he was also due to meet them right about now. The moment Hermes stepped onto the path that curved back toward the central corridor of Olympus, a path he technically shared with himself, the air grew lighter. Not in temperature, but in intention. It was the kind of atmospheric shift that happens when a space becomes too aware of who's walking through it, like a corridor, remembering it had been walked down before, and adjusting slightly to be a bit more mysterious. Hephaestus followed, brow furrowed, as they passed 3 identical statues of Hermes in different stages of thoughtfulness, one pondering a scroll, one smirking at a frog, and the last appearing to tie its own sandal into a metaphysical knot. You've curated this part of Olympus? Hephaestus observed, eyeing the architecture which flickered gently between stable and spontaneous. Some would call it a labyrinth, Hermes said, sidestepping a sign that politely directed travelers toward both directions at once. I call it efficient. I always know where I'm going, even when I don't. Do others? Not really, Hermes admitted. But they don't have to. Most visitors end up where they're meant to be. Eventually, they arrived at a small courtyard built entirely of suggestion steps that appeared only when approached walls that blurred if stared at too long, and a fountain that whispered postal codes from ancient languages. Hermes stopped, looked around, and clapped his hands once. Right on time, he said, as expected. By who? Hephaestus asked. By me, said another voice, identical, of course, and emerging from behind a nearby column, where a second Hermes, perhaps the same one, perhaps not, was already reading a scroll marked Memo to Self-Urgentish. The 2 Hermeses nodded at each other with the practiced ease of someone used to meeting himself at scheduled intervals. We need to streamline message delivery, the first Hermes said. Too many gods, not enough scroll space. I've begun using dream fragments and scented breezes to carry footnotes. It's not sustainable, the second Hermes agreed. The bees have started unionizing. They want shorter haikus. Hephaestus sat on the edge of the whispering fountain, resisting the urge to correct its pronunciation. So he said, slowly, Are you consulting yourself or coordinating? Both, Hermes. One replied, Olympus is, after all, a system of divine communication. And miscommunication, Hermes too added. That's where we flourish. But the messages are late, Hermes one said, and the prayers are tangled. Some mortals are receiving requests to light candles before they even wake up. Hermes too continued. One temple accidentally sang a song meant for sea gods during a thunder ritual. Poseidon sulked for hours, Hermes one noted. Hera's records are incomplete. Zeus is missing half a speech. And someone rerouted Dionysus's invitations through a satyr with stage fright. It was me, Hermes. Two admitted. But it was a Tuesday. Hephaestus rubbed his temples. What's your plan? We need redundancies, Hermes one said. backup messages, echoed confirmations, and some kind of receipt system that doesn't involve golden pigeons. They're temperamental, Hermes too agreed, and surprisingly, judgmental. So we're building a new archive, Hephaestus said, tapping the stone beside him. Layered memory, responsive ink, organizational enchantments. Perfect, Hermes, one said. And we'll need passageways that listen hallways that know where you meant to go, even if you forgot. That's dangerous, Hephaestus said. Only if you resist it. Hermes too replied. Olympus doesn't need roads. It needs roots of intent. That sounds very poetic, Hephaestus muttered. I've been working on my inner bard, Hermes I admitted. Dionysus has been coaching me, which reminds me. Hermes, II said, producing a folded piece of parchment from nowhere in particular, we need to deliver this next. He's expecting company, and possibly hallucinating about it already. He handed the parchment to Hermes I, who tucked it away with the practiced precision of someone who had never lost a document but had misplaced several concepts. Hephaestus stood. So what do you need from me? Anchors, Hermes, one said. Waypoints that resist distraction. Signs that say what they mean, Hermes, II added. And walls that don't move unless asked nicely. And fewer riddles, Hephaestus muttered. Some of your doorways are philosophical arguments. That's how they guard themselves, Hermes said. You wouldn't want a literal door answering every question. They get smug. We'll start reinforcing the message corridors, Hephaestus said. Use layered metal. Enchant the hinges to remember tone. Wonderful, Hermes. One said, I'll begin redirecting overflow scrolls to the new annex near Apollo's terrace, and I'll talk to the bees. Hermes too added, offer them lavender in exchange for shorter routes. How do you keep track of which of you is doing what Hephaestus asked? We don't both, Hermes said at once, but eventually everything gets done. With that, the second Hermes vanished behind a turning wall that wasn't there moments before, and the first Hermes turned toward the sea-facing corridor that now shimmered with the faint suggestion of a party already in progress. Dionysus next, he said cheerfully. I hope he's awake, or at least upright. Hephaestus followed, muttering something about reinforced barrels and ambivalent vines, as the two descended the sloping path lined with ivy and soft laughter toward a villa that had never seen silence, and was very likely, in the process, of misplacing its own roof again, just for effect. As they descended the path toward Dionysus's villa, the scent of fermenting grapes grew stronger, mingling with jasmine citrus, and the unmistakable aroma of spilled good intentions. Music fluttered through the air, not a melody so much as an argument between a harp and a tambourine. And occasionally, a distant cheer punctuated by the crash of something breakable landing where it probably wasn't meant to. Hermes stepped lightly, as if expecting the very ground to sway. Hephaestus, more grounded by nature and necessity, kept a firm grip on his toolkit and adjusted his gait for maximum balance, which proved useful when the marble steps briefly turned into pedals and then back again with only the faintest apology. Dionysus's domain had never been accused of stability. The villa appeared around a bend perched precariously on the edge of a cliff that changed height depending on mood. It was built from white stone and stained glass windows that rearranged themselves to better capture the light. Vines crawled up the walls with an enthusiasm bordering on scandalous. A satyr asleep in a wine barrel waved as they passed, or possibly dreamed of waving, and Hermes waved back just in case. The entrance was unsurprisingly open. Not in a symbolic sense, literally. There was no door, just a wide archway through which laughter spilled like perfume. Inside, cushions were strewn like fallen clouds, goblets clinked in lazy rhythm, and the air shimmered faintly with the promise of at least one dance still unfinished. Dionysus was reclining on a chaise lounge woven from fig leaves and implications. His robe, if one could call it that, was somewhere between silk and suggestion. He held a goblet that filled itself and emptied at whim, and wore a laurel crown that had recently been upgraded with small bells for flair. "Ah," he said, raising his glass without spilling a drop, the courier and the constructor. "Welcome to my symposium of semi-intentional enlightenment. We brought word from Olympus," Hermes said, sidestepping a tray of cheese that appeared to be philosophizing with a plum. "And a few questions." "Not too loud," Dionysus said, tapping his temple. "The wine is still thinking." Hephaestus folded his arms. "Apollo says the harmonies are frayed. Aphrodite thinks everyone's underappreciated. Artemis suspects the moon is misunderstood. And the archives whisper too much." "Delightful," Dionysus said, stretching like a satisfied thought. "So it's Thursday." Hermes unfolded Apollo's parchment. "We're harmonizing Olympus, realigning energies, soothing resonances, possibly enchanting some hallways." Dionysus accepted the parchment, squinting at it with one eye, and then handing it to a nearby dryad, who immediately used it to fan herself. "Charming," he said, "but if you want harmony, you'll need more than rhythm. You'll need permission. Permission for what Hephaestus asked. To forget the rules, Dionysus said, twirling his goblet. Temporarily. Repetition is stability, yes, but so is release. The divine mind grows stale when it forgets the joy of surprise. You're advocating chaos, Hephaestus muttered. I'm advocating revelry, Dionysus corrected. A moment out of time, an intermission. Even music rests. Even gods must wobble on purpose. So what do you suggest? Hermes asked. Dionysus stood well half-rose and leaned dramatically, which for him counted as effort. We throw a pause, he said. Not a festival. A soft unbinding. A gathering with no scripts, no expectations, just presence. A party, Hephaestus said. An unbranded gathering of resonant beings in relaxed proximity. Dionysus replied. With snacks. Hermes considered. Could it work? It always works, Dionysus said. Even when it doesn't, it reboots what matters. And hey, Hera, Hephaestus asked, what do we tell her? Tell her it's a recalibration, Dionysus said, or a temporary loosening of the marble. She'll understand. She hates cracks. He turned to a satyr nearby. Prepare the space. Inform the instruments. Summon only those who need to wander. The satyr nodded and promptly ran into a curtain. We'll need to stabilize the floor, Hephaestus muttered, and reinforce the wine vats. Do what you must. Dionysus said, waving his hand, as two goblets began dancing with each other. But do it lightly. Let the stone breathe. Let the walls echo joy for once. Hermes tucked the parchment away. You'll join us, then? I'll host it, Dionysus said, and I'll forget I'm hosting just long enough for the magic to start. As they turned to leave the villa behind them, began to shift, not drastically, but perceptibly. The colors warmed. The music softened. A harp tuned itself to a key never used, but always remembered. Outside, the air smelled brighter. Hermes and Hephaestus stepped back onto the path, now curving uphill toward the last of the Olympians on their itinerary, a goddess of strategy and silent decisions, whose mind held maps even the stars consulted, and who by now was undoubtedly waiting with a plan already written in the margins of history. The climb toward Athena's sanctuary was steep, not because of height, but because of intention. The path grew more defined with every step, cobblestones subtly shifting into alignment beneath their feet, and the occasional olive branch offering unsolicited advice. Here the air grew clearer, sharper, not cold, but composed, as if filtered through logic. Hermes slowed his pace, not from fatigue, but from an intuitive sense that rushing near Athena's realm would earn a disapproving glance, if not a full footnote. Hephaestus walked silently beside him, scanning the symmetry of the surrounding columns, which had clearly been designed by someone with strong feelings about balance and a slightly judgmental protractor. Athena's temple did not announce itself. It simply emerged from its surroundings, calm and undeniable. The entrance bore no fanfare, no incense, no delicate drapery, just a set of broad doors etched with diagrams of battles, harvests, and democratically tense debates. Above them, a frieze of owls watched quietly, judging nothing but noticing everything. Inside, the light filtered through high windows in orderly beams, illuminating scrolls stacked with deliberate care and a long table covered in maps that updated themselves only when no one was looking. Athena stood at the far end, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at a strategy diagram composed entirely of chess pieces and weather patterns. Her armor gleamed without ornamentation. Even the plume on her helmet looked like it had been instructed to behave. "You're late," she said, without looking up. "Only by 3 steps," Hermes replied. The ground argued. "Tell it to keep pace. Next time," she said. "Olympus needs discipline, not whimsy. We bring harmony," Hephaestus said, placing a small bundle of notes beside a scroll labeled "Contingency Divine Drift." "And maybe a little whimsy," Hermes added. Athena sighed, then looked up. "I've felt the dissonance. The temples waver, the prayers arrive with confusion. Even the owls have begun making unprompted suggestions." She gestured toward a perch where one particularly smug owl turned away, as if to say it had predicted their arrival and chosen not to announce it. Apollo's melody. Hermes offered, placing the folded parchment on her desk. Athena unfolded it without ceremony, scanned the notation, and hummed once, softly, precisely. "He chose a triple meter," she said. "Unexpected. He wanted something that allows for breathing," Hermes said. "And correction," Hephaestus added. Athena tapped the edge of the parchment with a stylus made from logic and leftover thunder. "Olympus isn't broken," she said. "It's unaligned. Each god drifting into their own domain. No shared objective, no unifying directive. That's why we've been circling," Hermes said, "stitching fragments, listening, tuning." Athena nodded. "And what have you learned?" "That control isn't cohesion," Hephaestus said, "and planning doesn't equal peace," Hermes added. "True," Athena said, not unkindly. "But structure provides space. Without foundation, even grace crumbles." She moved toward the table where a new scroll unrolled itself with a whisper. "I've drafted a proposal," she said. Not a command. A suggestion. A framework for future alignment. Not rigid. Adaptive. She handed it to Hephaestus, who read it with a craftsman's eye. Flexible timelines, intermittent gatherings, shared symbols. Emotional latitude, he read. That last one was a compromise, Athena said. Aphrodite insisted. Good Hermes said. She'll appreciate being appreciated. Athena turned to a nearby shelf and retrieved a sealed jar containing tiny flags, each representing a virtue, a vice, or a committee. Distribute these, she said. Place them subtly in each domain. They're reminders, anchors, quiet signals that Olympus is still a shared construct. Will they resist, Ares? Hephaestus asked. They'll confuse him just long enough to be effective, she replied. Hermes pocketed the jar. And Hera? He asked. Athena hesitated. She'll want accountability. Give her my schedule. Tell her I'm implementing a shared calendar with conditional flexibility. That sounds like poetry, Hermes said. It's a compromise, Athena corrected. But label it poetry if it sells. The owl on the perch hooted once, possibly sarcastically. Athena ignored it. And Zeus? Hephaestus asked. He's been quiet. Athena's expression tightened. He's waiting, watching. Sometimes the king waits to see if the kingdom can govern itself. Pride or caution, I'm not sure which. Hermes straightened the faintest glint of motion flickering behind his eyes. Then we prepare for his arrival. We prepare always, Athena said. But yes, expect observation. She moved toward the central chamber, where a circular table sat unused but dustless. This will be our meeting space. Not a council, a convergence, no thrones, just chairs. Equal height. What about the musicality? Hermes asked. We've given the melody to Ares, Apollo, Artemis. Dionysus is adjusting the mood. I'll weave it into the rhetoric, Athena said. A cadence of phrasing. Argument as dance. Debate as chord progression. Olympus as chorus. Hephaestus murmured, If it must sing. Athena replied, Let it do so deliberately. Hermes and Hephaestus turned to leave, plans in hand, signals secured the path behind them, clearer than it had been before. Athena returned to her scrolls, already adjusting a sentence on divine rest intervals to accommodate Hestia's new recommendations. Outside, the air held steady, as if waiting for the next note. And far beyond the temple's logic and precision, the weather began to shift slightly, as if Zeus had finally stirred, and the clouds were clearing their throats for the kind of arrival that did not announce itself with thunder, but with stillness. First, the climb to the high seat was neither steep nor arduous, yet it carried the weight of implication. The air thinned gently, not from altitude, but from anticipation. Every breeze, every cloud, every echo of a footstep seemed to pause, as if waiting for something long rehearsed, but never performed. Hermes and Hephaestus moved upward along a path that had no beginning, but clearly pointed toward an end. The marble here bore no decoration, just the faint shimmer of storms remembered and restraint imagined. Even the birds usually opinionated around Olympus had gone respectfully silent. At the summit sat the Hall of Consideration, which Zeus had not named, but had allowed to exist. It was not a throne room, though there was a chair. Not a court, though decisions had occurred there. It was a space built for watching, for waiting for weathering, without interference. They entered without announcement. The doorway didn't creak, didn't bow. It simply opened, as if it always had been. And inside, the clouds filtered light with studied neutrality. Zeus stood near the edge, gazing into the wide view of Olympus domains, sprawled in architectural metaphors from Demeter's quietly stubborn garden to Dionysus's villa that hummed with slightly tipsy harmony. His robes moved just slightly in the air, like smoke, remembering its purpose. His beard was well kept, though a little thunderous in texture, and his expression was calm, not the serenity of ignorance, but the patience of someone who knew the storm was optional. "You've spoken to them," he said, without turning. Hermes nodded. "Every domain, every god, even myself briefly." And Zeus asked, voice low and wide, "Olympus is not crumbling," Hephaestus said. "It's humming in separate keys." "And humming is dangerous," Zeus replied, "when you expect silence." "We've introduced a melody," Hermes said. Apollo wrote the bass. The others added measures, adjusted tone, and Aphrodite rearranged the lighting, Hephaestus added. "Naturally," Zeus murmured. He turned slowly, eyes the color of lightning, turned contemplative. "You think harmony is enough?" "No," Hermes said. "We think it's the beginning." Zeus walked to a large, circular table, Athena's table by design, but not by decree. He placed a hand on its smooth surface. "I built Olympus to endure," he said, "stone and sky and symbol. But I see now it was always the gods who made it live. And they've grown apart. Not broken," Hermes said, "just slightly individualized." "That's always the risk," Zeus said. "Immortality doesn't encourage collaboration, only endurance." "They've agreed," Hephaestus said, "to recalibrate, to acknowledge, to gather not in ceremony, in presence." Zeus raised an eyebrow. A gathering Dionysus's idea, Hermes said. But with structure, Apollo will set the tone. Athena is coordinating schedules. And, I assume, Hera has edited the guest list, Zeus said dryly. She's reviewing it twice, Hermes confirmed. With notes. Zeus smiled barely, but it happened. Then she hasn't lost faith. He moved toward a small window that looked directly into a cloud. I have waited, he said, not from fear, from respect. You don't lead the gods. You remind them to lead themselves. We've placed tokens, Hermes said, holding out Athena's jar. In every domain. Silent signals, shared symbols. Zeus took the jar, weighed it in his hand, and nodded. They'll be needed. The meeting space is ready, Hephaestus said. Athena designed it without hierarchy. Then I will sit where I am, asked, Zeus said. He turned again, looking at them both, not as messengers or craftsmen, but as makers of intention. And you, will you join? We'll keep walking, Hermes said. The path hums better with feet on it. And I'll reinforce what needs holding. Hephaestus said. The invisible is still weight. You've both done what many wouldn't, Zeus said. Not because you had to, because you saw it was needed. He moved to the center of the hall. Lightning crackled gently in the stone, just enough to remind the marble that it could be loud if necessary. Then it's time, he said, not for speeches, for stillness, and the kind of listening that doesn't interrupt. He raised his hand, and the clouds parted, not dramatically, not with thunder, just enough to let the first note of Apollo's melody drift through subtle and unfinished. Below, Olympus stirred. Columns leaned slightly toward the center. Gardens paused in their growth to listen. Even the echoing halls of Hades whispered more softly. And in the sky above, where light waits to become a story, the stars began blinking in rhythm, slow, thoughtful, and almost aligned. If Zeus was the stillness before a storm that never quite arrived, then Hera was the schedule it should have adhered to. As clouds adjusted themselves around the peak of Olympus, the queen of the gods was already seated at a table that had not yet been summoned, but was clearly expecting her. It stood in the pavilion of deliberation, a space between domes that the others referred to casually as the nice room with the soft chairs, but which Hera maintained as a bastion of order. Here, the columns didn't lean, they stood at attention. The ivy was symmetrical. The sun shone only at approved angles, and the guest cushions were fluffed to precisely the same depth. Hera's expression, while calm, carried the weight of centuries of reminders, the kind that were not shouted, but were written in triplicate and quietly filed under expected behavior. She was not waiting for Zeus, though she knew he would come, nor was she waiting for Hermes, though he was already on his way, with his sandals, making the kind of respectful silence that is only taught by experience. Hera was instead in the middle of reviewing a scroll that listed every god, demigod, muse, dryad, satyr, whisper, and metaphor that had been invited to the upcoming gathering. Her notes were methodical, margin-aligned, and coded with small symbols that only she, and possibly an unusually literate owl, could decode. When Hermes entered, she did not look up immediately. She finished marking a line with a quill made from a phoenix feather that had voluntarily resigned. Then she raised her gaze. "You're early," she said. "I aim for timely," Hermes replied, standing at a respectful distance from the chair marked Messenger Active. Hera gestured for him to sit, which he did, though the cushion tried to reassign itself briefly as a metaphor for hesitation. "I've received the notes," Hera said, "from Apollo. Athena, Aphrodite, though hers included a perfume sample and some very firm suggestions regarding drapery. She believes ambiance affects engagement, Hermes offered. She's not wrong, Hera replied. Even Zeus admitted the cloud cover was beginning to feel indulgent. She unrolled a new scroll, this one a chart of divine intersections, lines crisscrossing like the faint impressions of myths yet to be told. "We have one opportunity," she said, "one moment where all threads can be acknowledged without unraveling. If we don't coordinate properly, it becomes theater. And I do not permit theater without seating assignments." "It won't be theater," Hermes said. Dionysus promised only one musical interlude, and even that's contingent on the wine not arguing. Hera's lips twitched. "He says that every time." She reached into a lacquered box and retrieved small tokens, miniature depictions of each god symbol: a thunderbolt, an anvil, a dove, a scroll, a stalk of grain, a caduceus, and others not so easily defined. "These will be placed at the table," she said, "not as rank, but as rhythm. If they sit according to function, not power, the conversation will spiral instead of splinter." "You're choreographing the dialogue," Hermes realized. "Of course," Hera said. "Even discord can be productive if you assign it a seat." Hephaestus entered quietly, then carrying with him a diagram of the reinforced flooring that would support the gathering chamber. Hera took it without needing to glance and filed it between structural trust and interpersonal tension, mild. "The columns will absorb raised voices," Hephaestus said. "But they won't tolerate sarcasm above a certain pitch." good Hera said. Sarcasm should remain an undercurrent, not a wave. She handed Hephaestus a small scroll labeled Tonal Expectations Session 1. And Zeus? Hermes asked. Hera's expression softened by precisely half a degree. He knows when to enter, she said. His timing has always been better than his follow-through. She rose, then, not dramatically, but with the kind of practiced dignity that made the chairs rearrange themselves slightly in solidarity. The gathering begins at sunset, she said. I've already adjusted the horizon. Hermes blinked. You rescheduled the sun. Only by 7 degrees, Hera replied. It agreed eventually. And the others? Hephaestus asked. Arriving? Hera said. Some aware, some unaware, but all will feel the pull. Olympus is shifting. They'll feel it in their foundations. She walked to the center of the pavilion, where a circular mosaic depicted the original. Packed 12 gods standing in uncertain agreement. The image shimmered faintly now, as if remembering that once long ago they had all sat down and simply listened. Hera placed her hand on the mosaic. Let it not be unity, she said softly. Let it be shared divergence, in rhythm. Hermes and Hephaestus exchanged a glance. They'd carried scrolls and tools, melodies and metaphors, but now it was Hera who tuned the space, not with sound, but with purpose. Outside, the wind changed direction with the discretion of a servant resetting the table. The sky began its gradual shift to indigo. Somewhere in the distance, a harp began warming up, not to perform, but to prepare. And the gods scattered across domains of dream and domain began to feel the invitation stir beneath their feet. Not urgent, not loud, but present. As if Olympus had taken a deep breath and expected them to remember their lines, not to recite, but to rewrite them together. As the sun tilted politely in the sky, casting long shadows in shades approved by Hera's afternoon decree. The convergence chamber began to hum, not audibly, but atmospherically, as if the very concept of gathering had started to stretch its limbs. The chamber, constructed from materials both tangible and allegorical, was nestled in the heart of Olympus, where no single domain claimed ownership. Its pillars had been sourced from memories of unspoken agreements, and its ceiling was etched with a constellation that hadn't been named yet, but carried the shape of a conversation waiting to begin. The circular table at the center, built by Hephaestus and calibrated by Athena, had no designated head. Its surface gleamed without reflecting a gesture of neutrality. The chairs, 12 in number, with a few extra for metaphors or late arrivals, were arranged in a spiral, that allowed each occupant to face both the center and one another without choosing sides. Hermes was the first to arrive, not because he hurried, but because he carried the final checklist, which now unfolded itself into a scroll the length of an average mortal's autobiography. He moved with ease, adjusting the position of a chair slightly to accommodate Apollo's favored slouch, removing an unnecessary echo that had attached itself to Ares's usual seat, and tucking a small olive branch beneath Artemis's place, not for symbolism, but because it matched her preferred level of greenery. Hephaestus followed, rolling in a small cart of calibration tools and checking that the resonance-dampening runes beneath the floor were still holding firm. One tile clicked uncertainly and was quietly reassured. Hera arrived next, escorted not by fanfare, but by a brief realignment of the light. She moved to her chair, placed her scrolls in a measured arc around her, and nodded once. The air shifted as others began to appear. Apollo entered in a wash of golden tones, his lyre slung over his shoulder, and a tuning fork balanced behind one ear. He sat, and immediately began humming the gathering's bass chord, which the room absorbed gratefully. Artemis followed in near silence, placing a bundle of moonlight on the table before taking her seat, nodding once at her twin. Ares clanked in next, noticeably resisting the urge to announce his presence more forcefully. He sat with a controlled huff and tapped his foot once on beat. Dionysus floated in on a breeze scented with pomegranate and possibility, trailing a vine that curled affectionately around the base of his chair. He gave a lazy salute and winked at no one in particular. Aphrodite glided in her gown, slightly too elegant for sitting, but somehow still folding perfectly as she took her place. She placed a small mirror at the center of the table, not to reflect, but to suggest. Hestia arrived with no announcement, no shimmer. She simply was settling into her chair with the quiet grace of a fireplace accepting another log. Demeter followed her hands, dusted with flour, her sandals carrying a faint smell of harvest. She nodded to Hestia, who passed her a cup of something warm without speaking. Poseidon entered last among the Olympians, his trident absent, but his presence unmistakable. He brought with him a small jar of seawater, which he placed before him, as if to say, "Yes, I'm here, and yes, I remember." 11 seats filled, and the 12th remained briefly unoccupied. A moment stretched, not awkward, not tense, but aware. Then Zeus entered, not loudly, not with thunder, just presence. He moved to the final seat, paused to look around the circle, and then sat. The room held its breath. And then Apollo played a single note, soft, middle register, unassuming. It drifted across the table, landed nowhere in particular, and settled into the floor. Athena spoke first, not as host, but as catalyst. "We are here," she said, "not because we must agree, but because we must remember that we share this." She gestured to the room, to the table, to the mosaic of intention beneath their feet. This is not unity. This is proximity. And in that possibility, Hera unrolled a scroll and placed it at the center of the table. "This is not a record," she said. "It is a beginning. Edits welcome. Participation expected. Absence discouraged." Ares grunted. "No fighting." "Only if it's constructive," Athena replied. Dionysus raised a goblet, "and only if it rhymes." Laughter rippled, not uproarious, just warm, the kind that reminded the walls they didn't need to lean in. Artemis offered a pouch of lunar dust. "For marking changes," she said. "It won't erase, just soften." Hestia passed around small slips of parchment. "Write one thing you've forgotten," she said. "Keep it or burn it. But name it." Hephaestus placed a tiny anvil in the center. "If it holds, we build on it." Hermes produced a quill made from a feather that once sent a message no one read. "We'll write with what was missed." The mirror reflected no one, but glimmered gently with all. The room, now full, did not resonate. It listened, and far above, the sky darkened into evening, the stars aligning, not perfectly, but patiently, as if waiting for the first shared silence to be answered, not with words, but with attention that would in time become action. The stillness that followed their assembly was not empty, but textured, the kind of quiet that invited participation rather than demanded it. Each god sat surrounded not only by their symbols and scrolls, but by the invisible architecture of their histories, agreements, left vague rivalries, politely muted affection, carefully unsaid. It was not peace in the heroic sense, but something older, something resembling agreement by proximity. Apollo's fingers rested lightly on the strings of his lyre, producing no sound, just the memory of one. Artemis watched the center of the table as if it might move. It didn't, but it considered it. Hera's quill floated just above the scroll, waiting for a sentence that might begin without closure. Zeus, for once, had nothing to pronounce. He simply breathed with purpose. Athena began again, not to direct, but to guide. "We are not correcting Olympus," she said, her voice level, only remembering how it bends, not because of weakness, but because it was built to accommodate divine variance. Hermes nodded slowly. Harmony isn't sameness. It's shared deviation, agreed irregularity. Dionysus leaned back in his chair, swirling nothing in his cup. Improvised resonance, like a chorus that starts late but ends together. Poseidon raised one eyebrow, but said nothing. The jar of seawater before him began to ripple in a thoughtful rhythm. Demeter spoke next, her tone as even as tilled soil. Even cycles lose their measure when the moon stumbles, but the harvest adapts, always. And sometimes things must go fallow. Hestia added, her hands folded. Rest is not absence, it's preparation. Aphrodite looked into the mirror and said, "Care without confession. That's what keeps us beautiful." Ares crossed his arms, but didn't interrupt. That in itself was a contribution. Hera placed her hand on the scroll. "Then we write, not a decree," she said, "but a ledger of presence, of attended space, no verdicts, no binding, just reminders." A witness list Hermes offered, with no testimony required. Hephaestus unrolled a diagram onto the table's edge. "If we construct this," he said, "we do so in layers. The foundation is silent. The structure is optional. The door remains unlocked." Zeus leaned forward then. "And if we forget again?" "We will," Athena said. "Eventually. But the echo will remain." Apollo finished. In chord, in gesture. Artemis reached into her pouch and withdrew a small pebble. She placed it gently on the scroll. "This is the stone from my path," she said. "It tripped me once. I kept it. Now it marks something else." Aphrodite smiled without effort. "A stumble can be an invitation." Dionysus flicked a grape from his palm into the air. It never landed, but its absence made a shape in the space above them. And a missing beat can still count. Hera finally pressed her quill to the scroll and began writing. Not sentences, just lines, names, symbols, a list of those present, not ranked, not scored, simply acknowledged. Hermes passed the feather quill around the circle. Each god added their mark, some with ink, some with dust, some with nothing more than the imprint of intention. When it returned to Hera, the list glowed softly, not magically, but with the kind of quiet light that happens when a decision doesn't need to be declared to be real. Apollo strummed a single chord. This time it sounded, not loudly, just enough to mark the moment. Poseidon nodded once. Artemis exhaled. Demeter smiled as if to herself. Ares tapped the table once. Even that landed in time. "We'll meet again," Zeus said. Not a command. A memory written early. Hestia stood and relit a small flame at the center of the table. It was not ceremonial. It was practical. It flickered once, then steadied. Hera rolled up the scroll and placed it in a box lined with olive leaves and agreements not quite broken. She handed it to Hermes without looking. "You'll carry this," she said, "where it's needed. Not always physically, sometimes symbolically." Hermes accepted it with a rare reverence. "I'll deliver it gently." Hephaestus replaced the center anvil with a smaller one, lighter, portable, and noticeably unfinished. "We'll build more," he said, "or less if that's what's needed." Dionysus stood stretched and dropped a flower onto the table. "Then it started," he said, "or ended. It's hard to tell with gatherings." No one moved immediately. The chamber allowed the pause. The silence returned not emptier, but fuller now, as if the room had been taught a new note and was practicing how to hold it. One by one they stood, not together, not rehearsed, but close enough. They exited the chamber by separate paths, as was their nature. But the steps echoed now in a cadence that had not existed before. Outside, Olympus breathed again, not louder, but deeper. The sun, having held its place long enough now, resumed its descent, and in the long shadow of that shared moment, something shifted in the wind, a slow turning, not of fate, but of attention, preparing quietly for the arrival of something new. The chamber emptied, not with fanfare, but with gradual evaporation, like the final notes of a lullaby, remembered more for its rhythm than its words. Each god drifted away not as solitary figures departing, but as aspects of Olympus, returning to themselves, slightly more aware of the others. The marble corridors, once accustomed to the weight of declarations and dramatic exits, now simply accepted the passing of footsteps as it might accept the breeze, present, acknowledged, undisturbed. Hermes was the last to leave scroll in hand, his steps careful, not hurried. The box containing Hera's list seemed lighter than expected, not because it was small, but because its purpose had already begun to diffuse into the halls of Olympus, like the first smell of something baking before you know what it is. Outside the convergence chamber, the sky had settled into a blue so quiet it seemed newly invented. Hermes paused beneath a column carved with rhetorical flourishes, and for a moment he looked not like a messenger, but like someone who had just heard his own name in a dream. and wasn't sure whether to answer. Hephaestus was already walking back toward the forge, not in haste, but in rhythm. His steps clicked with intention, as if the stones beneath him understood they were about to be repurposed. He had a new project, not a tower, not a weapon, not even a structure in the traditional sense, but something more ephemeral, frameworks for future gatherings, hints of benches, foundations that knew when not to rise too far. As he passed through the lower passages, the torches relit themselves, one by one, not with urgency, but with welcome. Hera returned to her quarters with the kind of grace that made others adjust their posture. The scroll box, now absent from her hand, was not missed. It had served its function. She sat beside a window, overlooking the lesser courtyards, and observed the olive trees adjusting their branches. The leaves shimmered, as if they too had been in attendance. She took up a fresh piece of parchment, not to write a proclamation, but to draft a note of thanks to the Muses, whose absence had been conspicuous, but oddly appropriate. Apollo, meanwhile, stood at the edge of his balcony, the last notes of his chord still vibrating somewhere just beneath the surface of the breeze. He did not speak nor sing. He simply listened, head tilted slightly, as if waiting for the next phrase to come not from his own fingers, but from the air itself. Artemis had already vanished into the woods. Her passage through the trees was marked only by a subtle realignment of moonlight and a single owl that turned its head just enough to note her return. Her path would take her nowhere urgent, just somewhere familiar where the roots were old and the silence wasn't lonely. Dionysus had not gone far. He rarely did. His villa leaned slightly less now, as if reassured by his presence. He poured himself a drink that had no effect but comfort, and sat beneath an arch made of giggles and once-forgotten song lyrics. He raised a toast to no one, or perhaps to everyone, and the goblet twinkled approvingly. Aphrodite stood before her mirror again, though now it showed not just her, but the suggestion of others around the edge. Not reflections, impressions. A flicker of Artemis's quiet, a glint of Apollo's harmony, a wisp of Dionysus's unfiltered charm. She smiled slightly and smoothed a wrinkle in her robe that hadn't been there before, but now felt earned. Ares returned to his field, not to train, but to observe. The sparring grounds were quiet, the weapons resting at angles that suggested disuse rather than defeat. He walked among them, tapping one hilt, here adjusting a strap there, not inspecting. Reminding, he paused near a wooden dummy marked by too many hits, and replaced its splintered base with a fresh one, not because it had asked, but because it had stood. Demeter went to her grove where seeds planted, long ago, had begun to sprout. She crouched beside one unfamiliar shoot, touched its tiny leaves, and nodded once. A new variety, untitled, but promising. Hestia returned to her hearth, where the flames danced not for heat, but for rhythm. She added a single log, watched it catch, and then sat with her hands folded and her eyes soft. The fire knew she had returned. Poseidon walked the shore barefoot, his trident nowhere in sight. The tide rolled in with polite persistence, brushing against his toes before slipping back into itself. He looked at the horizon where the sea met the sky, like an old friend not seen in a while, and muttered something that only the waves could hear. Zeus lingered longer. Still, seated watching the marble cool beneath the absent feet of gods, he tapped the table once, not to summon, but to remember. Then he stood, stretched, and stepped out into a sky that had waited just long enough. He did not summon a storm. He merely adjusted the clouds slightly, just enough to let a single star appear early. Back in the chamber, the central flame still burned. Not tall, not bright, but steady. The chairs, now empty, remained arranged in their spiral, as if holding the shape of what had just been shared. And somewhere between stone and sky, Olympus exhaled. Not the end of tension, not the beginning of perfection, but the quiet acknowledgement of alignment. A start, perhaps, or a return, or something even less certain, but more sustaining, as Olympus drifted gently into its evening hush, the shared rhythm born from the convergence still lingered, not as a commandment etched in marble, but as a breath held just slightly longer than usual. In the quiet center of it all, the convergence chamber remained unguarded, not because it was forgotten, but because it was remembered too softly to disturb. The chairs stayed arranged, their cushions subtly adjusting themselves for future visitors who might sit and say nothing. The flame at the center flickered without theatrics, a slow pulse that marked time not in minutes or centuries, but in presence. Hermes, now alone near the outer edge of Olympus, walked a familiar path that had never quite decided where it began. The box in his hand, containing the scroll of quiet attendance, pulsed with a faint warmth that wasn't magical, but metaphorical, something like a thank you from the parchment itself. He didn't rush. He never did not when walking after a gathering, not when thoughts trailed behind like half-formed letters in the air. He passed through archways that used to speak in riddles, but now simply greeted him with a nod. An olive branch extended itself and then retracted, content just to be seen. In the mortal world, far below, the stars blinked through clouds arranged with unusual kindness. A sailor somewhere whispered a prayer he didn't realize was heard. A child dreamed of thunder that didn't frighten. A poet's ink dried before the final line, not in error, but in patient pause. Hermes stepped into a smaller chamber, one he rarely used. No scrolls here, no messages. Just a bench, a breeze, and a view of all directions at once. He set the box down and let it rest. It had done its work. Now it could wait. Not forever. Just until needed. Hephaestus, in the forge, was sketching a hinge, not because anything needed fixing, but because he'd decided hinges should hum a little when closed with care. Beside him, a cooling anvil released a soft exhale, as if grateful to have held something important. He adjusted the fire, not higher, but warmer, then returned to his drafting with a contented grunt. Hera, back at her writing desk, penned a letter, addressed to no one, detailing the way the light had shifted in the chamber, and how Ares had not interrupted once. She folded the page, tucked it into an envelope, shaped like continuity, and placed it in a drawer marked Personal Documentation, Do Not Reshelve. In her private garden, Demeter scattered a few seeds without ceremony. She didn't expect them to grow soon. That wasn't the point. Sometimes a gesture is enough. Aphrodite, brushing her hair before a mirror, now slightly less focused on her, alone paused to apply a touch of color that matched Artemis's cloak. She didn't need to. But she did. Artemis under the stars walked a path her feet knew better than her mind. She knelt briefly by a stream, drank without concern, and looked up at a moon that tilted just slightly in acknowledgement. Apollo played no music that night. He simply tuned his lyre to a note not found in mortal keys and let the silence hold the rest. Dionysus poured one last cup and placed it on an empty chair. It would be gone by morning. He didn't ask where. He never did. Ares remained in his field alone, but uncoiled. He sat beside a practice post and leaned his head back. No one to fight. No one to prove. Just the slow realization that the ground had shifted while he stood still. Poseidon, near the shore, let the tide reclaim a sculpture he'd made out of boredom and salt. It wasn't meant to last, but the wave that took it paused just long enough to be considered respectful. Hestia stirred the embers with a simple iron poker. The flames, steady and round, needed no tending, but appreciated the attention. She nodded once, then settled in for the night. Olympus, in this gentle stretch of hours, became less a mountain and more an idea woven from laughter that didn't interrupt footsteps, that didn't echo, and doorways that knew when not to close. Somewhere beyond even the furthest dome, a new god, not yet named, dreamed of joining. The stars whispered just loud enough for the dream to feel invited. And though no bell rang, no decree sounded, and no oracle stirred something in the fabric of eternity, adjusted itself, not in great shifts or prophesied upheaval, but in the way a blanket does when someone tugs it gently in sleep, seeking warmth without waking. Back in the convergence chamber, the flame flickered sideways for a moment, then steadied. A chair moved half an inch. Somewhere a breeze nudged a scroll open to a blank page. It would be read someday, but not now. For now, Olympus rested, not still, but suspended, not finished, but calm.